Yes, there is a way, if one dares to take it. Where his body has gone, why may not another body go? I have seen him myself crawl from his window. Why should I not imitate him and go in by his window? The chances are desperate, but my need is more desperate still. Welcome to the Dusk Bell. We're back, and we're going to be biting into Chapter 4 of Dracula tonight. Well, my bells, this is a good chapter. A lot happens. We get a lot of dreadful, horrible, scary, frightening, monstrous imagery. And I'm here to help you break it down and guide you through the book as usual. Seriously, I love this chapter. It's a wonderful chapter. And I mentioned on my Instagram that I'm surprised a lot of what is in this chapter gets cut from Dracula movies, because this is ripe for the picking. There is action, there is horror, there is emotion. There's a lot. There's a lot in this chapter, and it's really good. So the other night I was watching a movie called The House That Dripped Blood. I believe it was like a sometime 1970 or the first couple of years of the 70s. It was a Hammer horror movie. I can't recommend it. It wasn't that good. I did watch it because it had Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing in it. And there was a vampire in this story. But the man who played this vampire, the minute he came on screen, I thought, wow, you are a very Stoker accurate vampire. And I'm not just a vampire, I really felt like they had modeled the guy off of Dracula. And so I thought, wow, that in my head, you're going to be Dracula. He had the bushy hair, thin, dead look, old man, how we meet Dracula at the beginning of the novel. So maybe I'll pop, I don't know with copyright, but I'll try to pop a photo of the guy. The actor's name was Jeffrey Belden. Belden? Jeffrey Belden. Shout out. You are a very Stoker accurate vampire. But yeah, funny little anecdote. I have suffered many a horrible film for the sake of seeing vampires on screen. So there's a fun fact about me. All right, guys, chapter 4, let's get into it. We're still in Jonathan Harker's journal, and we're still using this copy of Dracula. I talked about this in our first episode. Certainly vampires had been in books before Dracula and had been in media in general, but not to the degree that we know them today. So again, this is your reminder that Victorian readers reading Dracula don't know vampire lore. They don't know how they work. At this point, we know that Dracula is, as Jonathan sees it, some type of evil. We've had the horrible scare of the 3 vampire women eating a baby, or, the book alluded to them eating a baby. One of them put her mouth up to Jonathan's neck. Jonathan actually makes mention in this chapter of the vampire woman wanting to suck his blood. In the notes of this chapter, it's remarked that maybe this was an oversight on Bram Stoker's part, because Jonathan wouldn't really know exactly that that's what she was trying to do. So Jonathan wakes up back in his room at Castle Dracula. And at the beginning of the chapter, he's not sure if what happened the night previous was a dream or was reality. And yet he tells us that there's some evidence in his room that's making him lean towards it being reality. So he says, I awoke in my own bed. If it be that I had not dreamt, the Count must have carried me here. I tried to satisfy myself on the subject, but could not arrive at any unquestionable result. To be sure, there were certain small evidences, such as that my clothes were folded and laid by in a manner which was not my habit. My watch was still unwound, and I am rigorously accustomed to wind it the last thing before going to bed, and many such details. But these things are no proof, for they may have been evidences that my mind was not as usual, and from some cause or another I had certainly been much upset. I must watch for proof. Of one thing I am glad. If it was that the Count carried me here and undressed me, he must have been hurried in his task, for my pockets are intact. I am sure that this diary would have been a mystery to him which he would not have brooked. He would have taken or destroyed it. So Jonathan is reassured that he still has his diary. So he knows that, if the Count had carried him back to his room after the incident, he didn't find his diary. And Jonathan thinks, well, maybe it was a dream because my diary is intact. And even though, my watch is not wound like I'm accustomed to, Jonathan also knows that he's kind of been going crazy. He talked about this in the last chapter. He feels, very oppressed by this castle, by the presence of the Count. And maybe I was a bit hard on him last chapter. My mother actually brought up a good point. She's been watching the episodes, and she was interested in maybe the effect that the castle has on Jonathan. We've gotten some clues that, it's not just that Dracula is a supernatural being living in a perfectly normal castle, but that maybe, his Dracula's supernatural nature has also made this castle a refuge for all of these evil or supernatural, preternatural forces. So if you remember in the last chapter, Jonathan remarks that even though all of the furniture is centuries old, and he knows this to be fact, that it still seems brand new. He remarked in the first chapter, actually this was the beginning of the second chapter, he remarked that the door of the castle seemed like it had never been opened. That's maybe more normal, but we'll see some more strangeness with the front door of the castle in this chapter. So maybe I was a bit mean to Jonathan. Maybe, when he went exploring, maybe forces in the castle have some sway over him. And maybe these forces made him fall asleep in the moonlit gallery he found himself in, where the vampire woman were almost able to prey upon him. So what do you guys think? Is Jonathan totally at fault for his stupid decisions or not? He did mention, in that chapter, he did mention that he sort of delighted in going against the Count's wishes because he felt so cooped up and claustrophobic. So, take a look at the book for yourself and tell me where you stand. Is Jonathan under some influence, or does he still have agency? He's just surrounded by supernatural forces. So our next entry in Jonathan's journal is 18th May. If you remember, I believe it was 7th May when we opened the book and he was in Bistritz. So it's been a good while. Jonathan actually goes back to that wing where he had encountered the vampire woman during the day because he wants to make sure that that wing exists to verify whether or not it was a dream. I've been down to look at that room again in daylight, for I must know the truth. When I got to the doorway at the top of the stairs, I found it closed. It had been so forcibly driven against the jamb that part of the woodwork was splintered. I could see that the bolt of the lock had not been shot, but the doors fastened from the inside. I fear it was no dream, and must act on this surmise. Our next entry is the next day. So Jonathan now is convinced that it's not a dream, and his next actions are going to be in accordance with that new belief of his. He does a lot in this chapter. He does a lot, and I'm still going to want your opinions. Would you do the things Jonathan does? Would you not do these things? Because I don't know. I'm on the fence. I want to give Jonathan the benefit of the doubt. I really do. And he has moments of astuteness, but I don't know. He does other things that I think, Jonathan, why are you doing that? Let's see. 19th May. I am surely in the toils. Last night the Count asked me in the suavest tones to write 3 letters. One saying that my work here was nearly done, and that I should start for home within a few days. Another that I was starting on the next morning from the time of the letter. And the third that I had left the castle and arrived at Bistritz. I would fain have rebelled, but felt that in the present state of things, it would be madness to quarrel openly with the Count whilst I am absolutely in his power, and to refuse would be to excite his suspicion and to arouse his anger. He knows that I know too much, and that I must not live, lest I be dangerous to him. My only chance is to prolong my opportunities. Something may occur which will give me a chance to escape. I saw in his eyes something of that gathering wrath, which was manifest when he hurled that fair woman from him. He explained to me that posts were few and uncertain, and that my writing now would ensure ease of mind to my friends, and he assured me with so much impressiveness that he would countermand the later letters, which would be held over at Bistritz until due time in case chance would admit of my prolonging my stay. That to oppose him would have been to create new suspicion. I therefore pretended to fall in with his views, and asked him what dates I should put on the letters. He calculated a minute, and then said, "The first should be June 12th, the second June 19th, and the third June 29th. I now know the span of my life. God help me." Dracula has asked Jonathan to post 3 letters, but when he writes the letters, to act as if they're in the future. So we are still 19th May, and Dracula is asking Jonathan to post letters for June 12th, June 19th, and June 29th. And he gives Jonathan a reason saying, well, go ahead and tell your family members and your loved ones that you're on your way. Because we don't have a lot of opportunity for posts, so we might as well anticipate your departure earlier so that they don't worry, and that when they get the letters, it will be in accordance of the timing of you leaving the castle. Of course, this is kind of flimsy, and you'll see in this chapter, obviously Dracula knows that Jonathan did not listen to him, and that Jonathan had this encounter with the 3 ghostly vampire-like women in the castle. Dracula knows that Jonathan might be very fearful right now, and that he also might think it was a dream. So Jonathan knows that Dracula knows he went exploring in places he shouldn't have been. But maybe to Jonathan, he's hoping Dracula thinks that it was, an innocent mistake. So you'll see in this chapter, Dracula and Jonathan are right now, I would say, a power struggle, but Dracula clearly has the upper hand, but neither of them are going to acknowledge what happened with the vampire women. So both of them are going to be playing a game throughout this chapter. It's a game of cat and mouse, and I'll let you guess who the cat is, and I'll let you guess who the mouse is. I now know the span of my life. God help me. Because at this point, Jonathan doesn't think that Dracula is going to let him escape, because he's seen too much, and there's too much doubt as to whether or not, it was an innocent mistake on Jonathan's part. He pretty firmly believes that Dracula is going to have to kill him. And he knows Dracula has done horrible things. We've witnessed some horrible things. The baby, the sneaking out of the castle. So Jonathan is in the clutches of a monster. 28th May. There is a chance of escape, or at any rate of being able to send word home. A band of Scani have come to the castle and are encamped in the courtyard. These Scani are gypsies. I have notes of them in my book. They are peculiar to this part of the world, though allied to the ordinary gypsies all the world over. There are thousands of them in Hungary and Transylvania, who are almost outside all law. They attach themselves as a rule to some great noble or boyar, and call themselves by his name. They are fearless and without religion, save superstition, and they talk only their own varieties of the Romani tongue. I shall write some letters home, and shall try to get them to have them posted. I have already spoken to them through my window to begin an acquaintanceship. They took their hats off and made obeisance and many signs, which, however, I could not understand any more than I could their spoken language. I have written the letters. Mina's is in shorthand, and I simply ask Mr. Hawkins to communicate with her. To her I have explained my situation, but without the horrors which I may only surmise. It would shock and frighten her to death were I to expose my heart to her. Should the letters not carry, then the Count shall not yet know my secret, or the extent of my knowledge. So Jonathan plans to give his letters to these Scani, who have been passing Castle Dracula. And he said that he's tried to communicate them, through his window, and that he doesn't speak their language, so they've kind of made signs at each other, but that he really can't interpret these well either. So it's a crapshoot for Jonathan, but he's gonna try. He's tried to create some link with these Scani people, and he's gonna give the letters to them so that hopefully these letters can secretly be posted. So to Mina, and again to Mr. Hawkins, to remind you, Mr. Hawkins, who's his boss, Mina, who's his fiancée. I have given the letters. I threw them through the bars of my window with a gold piece, and made what signs I could to have them posted. The man who took them pressed them to his heart and bowed, and then put them in his cap. I could do no more. I stole back to the study, and began to read. The Count has come. He sat down beside me and said in his smoothest voice as he opened 2 letters, The Scani has given me these, of which, though I know not whence they come, I shall, of course, take care. See, he must have looked at it. One is from you, and to my friend Peter Hawkins. The other. Here he caught sight of the strange symbols as he opened the envelope, and the dark look came into his face, and his eyes blazed wickedly. The other is a vile thing, an outrage upon friendship and hospitality. It is not signed. Well, so it cannot matter to us. And he calmly held letter and envelope in the flame of the lamp till they were consumed. So Jonathan gave these letters to the Scani, and then not 2 seconds later, Dracula comes in and is in possession of these letters. So the Scani are in allegiance to Dracula. Jonathan finds this out pretty quickly. Luckily for Jonathan, he did not sign his letter to Mina, but if you remember from the last chapter, he said he was going to be discreet and write to her in sort of symbols and in a way in which only the 2 of them could understand. Of course, he wrote to Mr. Hawkins and he signed his name. So here's where that game comes in. Dracula clearly knows that both of these letters are from Jonathan. He clearly knows, well, at least in my interpretation, that Jonathan has written in some secret shorthand language in the second letter. But Dracula's not going to totally let on. So they both know, but yet they're both remaining civil and playing this game. And you'll see that Dracula is increasingly going to have the upper hand here. Dracula burns the letter from Jonathan to Mina. So he tells Jonathan, like we just read, well, this letter to Mr. Hawkins, that's okay. And I respect Mr. Hawkins, and I respect you. And this is a letter signed from you, so we will post this letter. As for the letter with the symbols, he says, well, this letter isn't signed, so I don't know who this is from. I don't know who it's from, but it's all in shorthand, and so it must be a vile betrayal. Who would do such a thing? And he burns the letter in front of Jonathan. So he's playing with Jonathan. He's instilling the fear of God in Jonathan. The letter to Hawkins, that I shall of course send on, since it is yours. Your letters are sacred to me. Your pardon, my friend, that unknowingly I did break the seal. Will you not cover it again? He held out the letter to me, and with a courteous bow handed me a clean envelope. I could only redirect it and hand it to him in silence. When he went out of the room, I could hear the key turn softly. A minute later, I went over and tried it, and the door was locked. Dracula's going to post the letter to Mr. Hawkins, and then he locks Jonathan into the room. So let the games begin. When, an hour or two after, the Count came quietly into the room, his coming wakened me, for I had gone to sleep on the sofa. He was very courteous and very cheery in his manner, and seeing that I had been sleeping, he said, "So, my friend, are you tired? Go to bed. There is the surest rest. I may not have the pleasure to talk tonight, since there are many labors to me, but you will sleep, I pray." I passed to my room and went to bed, and, strange to say, slept without dreaming. Despair has its own calms. Our next diary entry is 31st May. It was 28th May when Jonathan tried to pass the letter on to the Scani, and then they promptly betrayed him. So he's been here for almost a month. Almost. Not quite yet, but we're getting there. 31st May. This morning when I woke, I thought I would provide myself with some paper and envelopes from my bag and keep them in my pocket, so that I might write in case I should get an opportunity. But again a surprise, again a shock. Every scrap of paper was gone, and with it, all of my notes, my memoranda relating to the railways and travel, my letter of credit, in fact, all that might be useful to me were I once outside the castle. I sat and pondered a while, and then some thought occurred to me, and I made search of my portmanteau and in the wardrobe where I had placed my clothes. The suit in which I had traveled was gone, and also my overcoat and rug. I could find no trace of them anywhere. This looked like some new scheme of villainy. So Dracula has taken all of Jonathan's notes, all of his paper. He's also taken his traveling clothes, the clothes that he was traveling in when we opened the novel. Not a good sign. 17th June, on my birthday. 17th June, so now 2 weeks have gone by. This morning, as I was sitting on the edge of my bed cudgeling my brains, I heard without a cracking of whips and pounding and scraping of horses' feet up the rocky path beyond the courtyard. With joy I hurried to the window and saw drive into the yard 2 great lighter wagons, each drawn by sturdy horses, and at the head of each pair a Slovak, with his wide hat, great nail-studded belt, dirty sheepskin, and high boots. They had also their long staves in hand. I ran to the door, intending to descend and try to join them through the main hall, as I thought that way might be open for them. Again a shock. My door was fastened on the outside. Then I ran to the window and cried to them. They looked up at me stupidly and pointed. But just then the hetman, note in the book, Polish translation of the German Hauptmann, leader or commander-in-chief of the army. The hetman of the Scani came out, and seeing them pointing to my window, said something, at which they laughed. Henceforth no effort of mine, no piteous cry or agonized entreaty, would make them even look at me. They resolutely turned away. The lighter wagons contained great square boxes with handles of thick rope. These were evidently empty by the ease with which the Slovaks handled them, and by their resonance as they were roughly moved. When they were all unloaded and packed in a great heap in one corner of the yard, the Slovaks were given some money by the Scani, and spitting on it for luck, lazily went each to his horse's head. Shortly afterwards, I heard the cracking of their whips die away in the distance. Both of Jonathan's glimmers of hope in the Scani and the Slovaks, the only people who have come near the castle, have been quickly dashed, because both of them have been revealed to be in league with Dracula. First the Scani, who immediately betray him and give his letters to Dracula, and then the Slovaks who, when Jonathan tries to communicate to them, they quickly start laughing at him and, write him off and then refuse to even acknowledge him. There is this idea of West versus East. And it's no secret that in Dracula, a big theme is fear of the foreigner. I think it's natural. I mean, that Jonathan is going to, he describes them as lazy. And clearly they're in league with Dracula, who's this awful person. So we're getting negative characterization, not only just of Dracula, but of the people in this place. Of course, we get positive characterizations. There was the woman in chapter 1 who gave Jonathan the crucifix and who was clearly upset at the prospect of him going to Castle Dracula. But we also get, these populations within Romania and Transylvania. The Scani, the Slovaks, the Sagani being, a type of gypsy. So, and they're very negatively characterized. And, fair enough from Jonathan, who's a prisoner and needs help, and they're not helping him. So within the narrative of the story, fair enough. In the greater cultural context at the time, you can see, though, that maybe this characterization is reflective of attitudes in the West at the time. So the encounter with the Slovaks happens on 17th June, which again is my birthday. Our next diary entry is 24th June. Jonathan says that the Count had left early this day. Jonathan is looking out the window and he can hear that the Scani are somewhere in the castle and they're doing work. He says, "I know it, for now and then I hear a far-away muffled sound as of mattock and spade, and whatever it is, it must be to the end of some ruthless villainy." Jonathan continues sitting at the window, and eventually he sees the Count come out of the window and start making his way down the castle wall like that first horrifying time that he had seen the Count do this. Except this time, there is another layer of horror. So he says that the Count, over his back, has the bag that he had seen the vampire women take with them and in which he thought there was a baby. So we know that there are going to be more victims in this bag, most likely. The second thing is that Dracula is wearing Jonathan's clothing. So he's wearing the clothing that had been taken from his room and that Jonathan wore coming to Castle Dracula. So Jonathan says, "This then is his new scheme of evil, that he will allow others to see me as they think, so that he may both leave evidence that I have been seen in the towns or villages posting my own letters, and that any wickedness which he may do shall by the local people be attributed to me." It makes me rage to think that this can go on, and whilst I am shut up here, a veritable prisoner, but without that protection of the law which is even a criminal's right and consolation. So Jonathan sits around. I mean, he's a prisoner. He doesn't have that much to do. At this point, he's not venturing out. It sounds like since his adventure, since going back to the moonlit gallery and verifying that it was real, I don't think he's ventured out anymore. So this night, after the Count has left the castle, he's staying put. He's staying at the window. Eventually night falls, and Jonathan says that he starts to notice these trails of dust in the moonlight, kind of dancing in the wind. He says they whirled round and gathered in clusters in a nebulous sort of way. I watched them with a sense of soothing, and a sort of calm stole over me. I leaned back in the embrasure in a more comfortable position so that I could enjoy more fully the aerial gambolling. Something made me start up, a low, piteous howling of dogs somewhere far in the valley, which was hidden from my sight. Louder it seemed to ring in my ears, and the floating motes of dust to take new shapes to the sound as they danced in the moonlight. I felt myself struggling to awake to some call of my instincts, nay, my very soul was struggling, and my half-remembered sensibilities were striving to answer the call. I was becoming hypnotized. Quicker and quicker danced the dust, and the moonbeams seemed to quiver as they went by me into the massive gloom beyond. More and more they gathered, till they seemed to take dim, phantom shapes. And then I started, broad awake and in full possession of my senses, and ran screaming from the place. The phantom shapes, which were becoming gradually materialized from the moonbeams, were those of the 3 ghostly women to whom I was doomed. I fled, and felt somewhat safer in my own room, where there was no moonlight and where the lamp was burning brightly. So, Jonathan, those clouds of dust he had seen sitting at the window were the 3 vampire women. So they're in this misty dust form. And the movements when they were moving as mist, as dust, sort of hypnotized Jonathan. And he was only startled awake when he heard the wolves starting to howl. And then he runs back to his room. So I believe, for clarity, there's a window, in the hallway outside of his room, in that little wing area that he has and that he described in chapter 2. He's staying in that area, but there is that window that he can go to and from which he's seen the Count come and go. This is interesting because, like I said at the beginning of this video, maybe I didn't give Jonathan enough benefit of the doubt. This mist had him hypnotized, and he said he was sitting back and enjoying these shapes. So maybe that night wherein he fell asleep in the gallery, or when he felt compelled to explore through this door, maybe there was some force, or maybe he went, of his own will into the moonlit gallery, but then, that force of the phantom women lulled him to sleep. Could be. Now, this next part of the book is truly horrifying. I haven't seen this in an adaptation of Dracula. Now, I haven't seen every Dracula adaptation under the sun. I know there's a TV series, and there are a couple of movies that are still on my list to watch. But the biggest ones, I haven't seen this represented in them. When a couple of hours had passed, I heard something stirring in the Count's room. Something like a sharp wail, quickly suppressed. And then there was silence. Deep, awful silence, which chilled me. With a beating heart, I tried the door. But I was locked in my prison and could do nothing. I sat down and simply cried. So at this point, more than one time, Dracula has locked Jonathan in his room. I don't think Dracula is too worried now about hiding, his monstrous activities from Jonathan. And he's certainly not trying to hide the fact that he's keeping Jonathan in the castle. As I sat, I heard a sound in the courtyard without, the agonized cry of a woman. I rushed to the window, and throwing it up, peered out between the bars. There, indeed, was a woman, with disheveled hair, holding her hands over her heart as one distressed with running. So we can imagine this woman, panting, running, her hand over her heart. She was leaning against a corner of the gateway, collecting herself, presumably. When she saw my face in the window, she threw herself forward and shouted in a voice laden with menace, "Monster, give me my child!" She threw herself on her knees and, raising up her hands, cried the same words in tones which wrung my heart. Then she tore her hair and beat her breast and abandoned herself to all the violences of extravagant emotion. Finally, she threw herself forward, and though I could not see her, I could hear the beating of her naked hands against the door. Somewhere high overhead, probably on the tower, I heard the voice of the Count calling in his harsh, metallic whisper. His call seemed to be answered from far and wide by the howling of wolves. Before many minutes had passed, a pack of them poured, like a pent-up dam when liberated, through the wide entrance into the courtyard. Into the courtyard where this woman is. There was no cry from the woman, and the howling of the wolves was but short. Before long, they streamed away singly, licking their lips. I could not pity her, for I knew now what had become of her child, and she was better dead. What shall I do? What can I do? How can I escape from this dreadful thrall of night and gloom and fear? Everything in that scene is awful and horrible, to the point where maybe I don't want to see that represented in a Dracula film. You know, it's funny being into horror, in general, Gothic horror. I know there are a lot of horror fans who say that they've seen so much horror, they still like the genre, but that nothing really scares them. I'm not like that. I like horror, but I really have to vet, especially movies, what movies I watch, because I don't have a tolerance for everything in horror. I love Gothic horror and I love reading horror because it allows me to engage with the genre in a way that feels safer to me. But I think a lot of people think, when I say I'm super into vampire stories or Gothic horror, that I'm not scared by them. A mother whose child has been violated and murdered and desecrated by monsters, and monsters described in the book as really like demons from hell. Just the image of this mother, a mother's wrath, a mother's fury, a mother's fear, a mother's love for their child, coming into the courtyard, mistaking Jonathan for the one who has taken her child, yelling at him, beating at the door, seemingly having run for who knows how long, upon realizing that her baby has been taken. And, maybe she has some idea of what's happened. She knows her baby has been kidnapped with the people who Jonathan encountered. Maybe she knows that, Dracula is a murderer and drinks blood and is a monster. And yet she's a mother. So what can she do but go after, run into this pit of hell in search of her innocent child? It's awful. It's horrifying. In this day and age, vampires are the butt of many jokes. And there's really a lot of vampire media maybe they've lost their edge a bit. But this is really, the depths of evil. And just that way that Stoker describes this, he's standing at the top of the tower. Jonathan sees this play out. So Jonathan's kind of in the middle. This woman is down in the courtyard. And then you can imagine Dracula maybe hidden in shadow. He says his voice is metallic and calling these wolves to descend upon and rip this woman to shreds. I mean, what a scene. What a scene. 25th June, morning. No man knows till he has suffered from the night how sweet and how dear to his heart and eye the morning can be. When the sun grew so high this morning that it struck the top of the great gateway opposite my window, the high spot which it touched seemed to me as if the dove from the ark had lighted it there. My fear fell from me as if it had been a vaporous garment which dissolved in the warmth. I must take action of some sort whilst the courage of the day is upon me. Last night one of my post-dated letters went to post, the first of that fatal series which is to blot out the very traces of my existence from the earth. So you cannot extrapolate religious imagery from Dracula. Dracula is damned, is of hell. Anything that combats Dracula is holy, is of God. And Jonathan uses the religious imagery here of the dove from the ark. And we do get a sense that it ignites something in him. Jonathan says, It has always been at night time that I have been threatened, or in some way in danger or in fear. I have not yet seen the Count in the daylight. Can it be that he sleeps when others awake, that he may be awake whilst they sleep? If I could only get into his room. Jonathan is going to hatch a plan. If I could only get into his room. But there is no possible way. The door is always locked. No way for me. Yes, there is a way, if one dares to take it. Where his body has gone, why may not another body go? I have seen him myself crawl from his window. Why should I not imitate him and go in by his window? The chances are desperate, but my need is more desperate still. You know how they say, desperate times call for desperate measures? I like this version better. The chances are desperate, but my need is more desperate still. I shall risk it. At the worst, it can only be death. And a man's death is not a calf's, and the dreaded hereafter may still be upon me. God help me in my task. Goodbye, Mina. If I fail, goodbye. My faithful friend and second father, goodbye all, and last of all, Mina. So Jonathan's ready to risk it all, and he says, at least if I die, it will be a man's death. I'll be going to God, and not, a part of whatever hell I'm in right now. Same day, later. I have made the effort, and, God helping me, have come back safely to this room. I must put down every detail in order. I went whilst my courage was fresh straight to the window on the south side, and at once got outside on the narrow ledge of stone which runs round the building on this side. The stones were big and roughly cut, and the mortar had by process of time been washed away between them. I took off my boots and ventured out on the desperate way. I looked down once, so as to make sure that a sudden glimpse of the awful depth would not overcome me, but after that kept my eyes away from it. Now this part would make for a great scene in a movie. Jonathan is scaling the side of the wall, going down to Dracula's room, which we know is, I think, slightly below him. I couldn't do it. I wouldn't be doing this. I knew pretty well the direction and distance of the Count's window, and made for it as well as I could, having regard to the opportunities available. I did not feel dizzy. I suppose I was too excited, and the time seemed ridiculously short till I found myself standing on the windowsill and trying to raise up the sash. So he makes it. I was filled with agitation, however, when I bent down and slid feet foremost in through the window. Then I looked around for the Count, but, with surprise and gladness, made a discovery. The room was empty. It was barely furnished with odd things, which seemed to have never been used. The furniture was something the same style as that in the south rooms, and was covered with dust. I looked for the key, but it was not in the lock, and I could not find it anywhere. I'm not so sure that I would be sure of where the key was. This feels kind of video gamey. Have you ever played a video game and you have to open a lock? And it's like, oh, here, let's look around this room for the code to the lock. And there's like some letter or some post-it note that conveniently, has a 4-number code or a computer password on it that you need. And you're like, that would just be really convenient. I don't know. In this whole castle, maybe. I don't know. Maybe that was commonplace at the time. Keep any keys you have in your bedroom. But I just feel like in this whole castle, I wouldn't be as confident as Jonathan is about finding a key in the Count's bedroom. So really, Jonathan's taking a risk. And I suppose you could argue that risk is justified. Maybe I'm just not a risk taker. What would you... I don't know. But Jonathan's ready to risk it all. Of that, we're sure. So let's see how he fares. The room was barely furnished with odd things, which seemed to have never been used. The furniture was something the same as that in the south rooms, and was covered with dust. I looked for the key, but it was not in the lock, and I could not find it anywhere. The only thing I found was a great heap of gold in one corner. Gold of all kinds, Roman and British and Austrian and Hungarian, and Greek and Turkish money, covered with a film of dust, as though it had lain long in the ground. None of it that I noticed was less than 300 years old. There were also chains and ornaments, some jeweled, but all of them old and stained. At one corner of the room was a heavy door. I tried it, for, since I could not find the key of the room or the key of the outer door, which was the main object of my search, I must make further examination, or all my efforts would be in vain. It was open, and led through a stone passage to a circular stairway, which went steeply down. I descended, minding carefully where I went, for the stairs were dark, being only lit by loopholes in the heavy masonry. At the bottom there was a dark, tunnel-like passage, through which came a deathly, sickly odor, the odor of old earth newly turned. As I went through the passage, the smell grew closer and heavier. At last I pulled open a heavy door which stood ajar, and found myself in an old, ruined chapel, which had evidently been used as a graveyard. The roof was broken, and in 2 places were steps leading to vaults, but the ground had recently been dug over, and the earth placed in great wooden boxes, manifestly those which had been brought by the Slovaks. There was nobody about, and I made search for any further outlet, but there was none. Then I went over every inch of the ground so as not to lose a chance. I went down even into the vaults where the dim light struggled, although to do so was a dread to my very soul. Into 2 of these I went, but saw nothing except fragments of old coffins and piles of dust. In the 3rd, however, I made a discovery. There, in one of the great boxes, of which there were 50 in all, on a pile of newly dug earth, lay the Count. He was either dead or asleep. I could not say which, for the eyes were open and stony, but without the glassiness of death, and the cheeks had the warmth of life through all their pallor, and the lips were as red as ever. But there was no sign of movement, no pulse, no breath, no beating of the heart. I bent over him and tried to find any sign of life, but in vain. He could not have lain there for long, for the earthy smell would have passed away in a few hours. By the side of the box was its cover, pierced with holes here and there. I thought he might have the keys on him. When I went to search, I saw the dead eyes, and in them, dead though they were, such a look of hate, though unconscious of me or my presence, that I fled from the place, and leaving the Count's room by the window, crawled again up the castle wall. Regaining my own chamber, I threw myself panting upon the bed and tried to think. Now that's freaky. And again, you have to put yourself in this frame of mind. Try as best you can to erase what you know of vampires from your mind. Jonathan finds him lying in a box of dirt, eyes wide open, seemingly dead, and yet has more color in his face than Jonathan has ever seen him with. Super red in the lips, eyes open, but Jonathan says they don't have the glassiness of death. So that's so freaky. I mean, imagine you come across, a big box, the seeming coffin, but basically a box of earth with a body lying in it of someone who you've been talking to, you've been around, and yet they're this vivid color. Side note, this is why I love Technicolor movies and why I think the Hammer horror movies are so great. You need vivid color when you do Dracula. I mean, because you gotta have the iconic red. But it's true that so much of a vampire's state is expressed through their color. You have this we talk about the pallor of Dracula and the white and grayness of his being. But when he's fed, there's this deep blood red to the lips and these piercing eyes. So for that reason, I will always love, movies like the Hammer horror movies where you get just such saturated color. There's something so visceral to it, and it doesn't all detract from the horror. It adds to it. So now we come to 29th June, and 29th June is the date of the last letter which Dracula had asked Jonathan to write. Today is the date of my last letter, and the Count has taken steps to prove that it was genuine, for again I saw him leave the castle by the same window, and in my clothes. As he went down the wall, lizard fashion, I wished I had a gun or some lethal weapon that I might destroy him. But I fear that no weapon wrought alone by man's hand would have any effect on him. I dared not wait to see him return, for I feared to see those weird sisters. I came back to the library and read there till I fell asleep. I was awakened by the Count, who looked at me as grimly as a man can look. It's kind of like a jump scare in the book. The Count said, "Tomorrow, my friend, we must part. You return to your beautiful England. I to some work which may have such an end that we may never meet. Your letter home has been dispatched. Tomorrow I shall not be here, but all shall be ready for your journey. In the morning come the Scani, who have some labors of their own here, and also come some Slovaks. When they have gone, my carriage shall come for you, and shall bear you to the Borgo Pass to meet the diligence from Bukovina to Bistritz. But I am in hopes that I shall see more of you at Castle Dracula." I suspected him, and determined to test his sincerity. Sincerity? Seems like a profanation of the word to write it in connection with such a monster. So I asked him point blank, "Why may I not go tonight?" Jonathan's getting bold. "Because, dear sir, my coachman and horses are away on a mission." Jonathan says, "But I would walk with pleasure. I want to get away at once." Dracula smiled. Such a soft, smooth, diabolical smile that I knew there was some trick behind his smoothness. He said, "And your baggage?" "I do not care about it. I can send for it some other time." The Count stood up and said with a sweet courtesy which made me rub my eyes, it seemed so real, "You English have a saying which is close to my heart, for its spirit is that which rules our boyars. Welcome the coming, speed the parting guest. Come with me, my dear young friend. Not an hour shall you wait in my house against your will, though sad am I at your going, and that you so suddenly desire it. Come." So here is that game that Dracula has been playing with Jonathan, and I think we're about to see its culmination. With a stately gravity, he, with the lamp, preceded me down the stairs and along the hall. Suddenly he stopped. And I will add, again, I think this was kind of stupid of Jonathan. Dracula tells him the plans. "All right, tomorrow you're leaving." Now, I know there's question as to whether or not that would actually happen. But, Dracula is being courteous, whether it's genuine or not. And then Jonathan's like, "No, I want to leave now." And Dracula's like, "Well, what about your baggage?" And Jonathan's like, No, I don't care. I don't care about my baggage. I'm just going to leave. I'll walk. I don't care that your coachman's not available. I'll walk." I said this in the last video. I would be more discreet. I don't know. I just would be more discreet. And I think this next part might add some credence to that choice of mine. So Dracula is leading Jonathan down the hall. He's like, "Fine. You don't have to stay an hour in my castle that you don't want to stay." Which, again, power move, because Dracula knows that Jonathan knows that he's been keeping him prisoner for over a month at this point. So they're going down the hall. Suddenly Dracula stopped. Hark! Close at hand came the howling of many wolves. It was almost as if the sound sprang up at the raising of his hand, just as the music of a great orchestra seems to leap under the baton of the conductor. After a pause of a moment, he proceeded in his stately way to the door, drew back the ponderous bolts, unhooked the heavy chains, and began to draw it open. To my intense astonishment, I saw that it was unlocked. Suspiciously, I looked all round, but could see no key of any kind. As the door began to open, the howling of the wolves without grew louder and angrier. Their red jaws, with champing teeth, and their blunt-clawed feet as they leaped, came in through the opening door. I knew then that to struggle at the moment against the Count was useless. With such allies as these at his command, I could do nothing. But still the door continued to slowly open, and only the Count's body stood in the gap. Suddenly it struck me that this might be the moment, and the means of my doom. I was to be given to the wolves, and at my own instigation. Yeah, Jonathan, what can I say? At this point, here Dracula is toying with his prey. Jonathan is about to be eaten by wolves that are, trying to come into this great door. At this point, Dracula and I would be BFFs. I'd be slinging back that wine that Dracula offered to Jonathan on the first night, chatting up a storm with him, having a good time. I would have never, like I said, left the chamber. After I saw him crawl on the wall like that, no. Now, I know what you're going to say. Danny, he was going to kill you anyways. Well, maybe so, but I'd be having a lot better time than Jonathan is right now. I would go out having been wined and dined by a vampire. Suddenly it struck me that this might be the moment and the means of my doom. I was to be given to the wolves, and at my own instigation. There was a diabolical wickedness in the idea great enough for the Count. And as a last chance, I cried out, "Shut the door, I shall wait till morning," and covered my face with my hands to hide my tears of bitter disappointment. With one sweep of his powerful arm, the Count threw the door shut, and the great bolts clanged and echoed through the hall as they shot back into their places. In silence, we returned to the library. Again, Dracula making power moves. And after a minute or two, I went to my own room. The last I saw of Count Dracula was his kissing his hand to me, with a red light of triumph in his eyes, and with a smile that Judas in hell might be proud of. When I was in my room and about to lie down, I thought I heard a whispering at my door. I went to it softly and listened. Unless my ears deceived me, I heard the voice of the Count. "Back, back, to your own place. Your time is not yet come. Wait, have patience. Tomorrow night is yours." There was a low, sweet ripple of laughter, and in a rage I threw open the door, and saw without the 3 terrible women licking their lips. As I appeared, they all joined in a horrible laugh and ran away. I came back to my room and threw myself on my knees. Is it then so near the end? Tomorrow! Lord, help me, and those to whom I am dear. We have a little note underneath this portion, and it says, in all British editions, Dracula says only, tomorrow night is yours. But in the 1899 American edition, this sentence begins with the line, "Tonight is mine," stating baldly that Dracula plans to feed on Jonathan. Stoker's deletion of this sentence was understandable, for it leads to a different novel, one probably unpublishable in 1897 England. Stoker may have imagined that the America that produced his hero Walt Whitman would be more tolerant of men feeding on men. Stories take on new life through the decades. Dracula certainly has. My favorite Dracula movie is the 1979 Dracula. the character's relationship to sexuality defines a lot of the story and what it ends up saying. So in the 1979 movie, the sexuality is actually portrayed as a liberating thing for women. Here, we get these homoerotic undertones. It's what makes this story so interesting because there are so many different layers. There are so many dynamics that you can read into vampires and all this eroticism. So yeah, let me know your thoughts on that. 30th June, morning. These may be the last words I ever write in this diary. I slept till just before dawn, and when I woke, threw myself on my knees, for I determined that if death came, he should find me ready. At last I felt that subtle change in the air, and I knew that the morning had come. Interesting, if you remember in the last chapter, Jonathan was talking about how he had heard that people tend to die, at that time when the light changes to morning. Then came the welcome cock crow, and I felt that I was safe. With a glad heart, I opened my door and ran down to the hall. I had seen that the door was unlocked, and now escape was before me. With hands that trembled with eagerness, I unhooked the chains and drew back the massive bolts. But the door would not move. Despair seized me. I pulled and pulled at the door, and shook it till, massive as it was, it rattled in its casement. I could see the bolts shot. It had been locked after I left the Count. Then a wild desire took me to obtain that key at any risk, and I determined then and there to scale the wall and gain the Count's room. He might kill me, but death now seemed the happier choice of evils. Without a pause, I rushed up to the east window and scrambled down the wall as before into the Count's room. It was empty, but that was as I expected. I could not see a key anywhere, but the heap of gold remained. I went through the door in the corner and down the winding stair and along the dark passage to the old chapel. I knew now well enough where to find the monster I sought. The great box was in the same place, close against the wall, but the lid was laid on it, not fastened down, but with the nails ready in their places to be hammered home. I knew I must search the body for the key. So I raised the lid and laid it back against the wall. And then I saw something which filled my very soul with horror. There lay the Count, but looking as if his youth had been half renewed. For the white hair and mustache were changed to dark iron gray. The cheeks were fuller, and the white skin seemed ruby red underneath. The mouth was redder than ever, for on the lips were gouts of fresh blood, which trickled from the corners of the mouth and ran over the chin and the neck. Even the deep, burning eyes seemed set amongst swollen flesh, for the lids and pouches underneath were bloated. It seemed as if the whole awful creature were simply gorged with blood. He lay like a filthy leech, exhausted with his repletion. I shuddered as I bent over to touch him, and every sense in me revolted at the contact. But I had to search, or I was lost. The coming night might see my own body a banquet in a similar way to those horrid three. I felt all over the body, but no sign could I find of the key. Then I stopped and looked at the Count. There was a mocking smile on the bloated face, which seemed to drive me mad. This was the being I was helping transfer to London, where perhaps for centuries to come, he might, amongst its teeming millions, satiate his lust for blood and create a new and ever-widening circle of semi-demons to batten on the helplessness The very thought drove me mad. A terrible desire came upon me to rid the world of such a monster. There was no lethal weapon at hand, but I seized a shovel, which the workmen had been using to fill the cases, and lifting it high, struck with the edge downward at the hateful face. Not to break the ambiance, but would you do this? Would you do this? Let's continue. But as I did so, the head turned, and the eyes fell full upon me, with all the blaze of basilisk horror. That is fantastic imagery, with all their blaze of basilisk horror. So Dracula has not awoken or anything, but he has this wide-eyed look, and when Jonathan bashes him in the head, his head just moves and fixates on Jonathan. The sight seemed to paralyze me, and the shovel turned in my hand and glanced from the face, nearly making a deep gash above the forehead. The shovel fell from my hand across the box. As I pulled it away, the flange of the blade caught the edge of the lid, which fell over again and hid the horrid thing from my sight. Yeah, so in this moment, he bashes Dracula's face. He turns Dracula's face towards him. Jonathan releases the shovel, which hits the lid falls, so it's a dramatic moment that happens. The last glimpse I had was of the bloated face, blood-stained and fixed with a grin of malice, which would have held its own in the nethermost hell. I thought and thought what should be my next move, but my brain seemed on fire, and I'd waited with a despairing feeling growing over me. As I waited, I heard in the distance a gypsy song sung by the merry voices coming closer, and through their song the rolling of heavy wheels and the cracking of whips. The Scani and the Slovaks of whom the Count had spoken were coming. With a last look around, and at the box which contained the vile body, I ran from the place and gained the Count's room. So he runs back up the stairs to the Count's room, determined to rush out at the moment the door should be opened. With strained ears, I listened. So he's gonna try to get to the main door when the Slovaks and the Scani get there. With strained ears, I listened, and heard downstairs the grinding of the key in the great lock and the falling back of the heavy door. There must have been some other means of entry, or someone had a key for one of the locked doors. Then there came the sound of many feet tramping and dying away in some passage, which sent up a clanging echo. I turned to run down again towards the vault, where I might find the new entrance, but at the moment there seemed to come a violent puff of wind, and the door to the winding stair blew to with a shock that set the dust from the lintels flying. When I ran to push it open, I found that it was hopelessly fast. I was again a prisoner, and the net of doom was closing round me more closely. As I write, there is in the passage below a sound of many tramping feet, and the crash of weights being set down heavily. Doubtless the boxes, with their freight of earth. There is a sound of hammering. It is the box being nailed down. Now I can hear the heavy feet tramping along the hall, with many other idle feet coming behind them. The door is shut, and the chains rattle. There is a grinding of the key in the lock. I can hear the key withdrawn. Then another door opens and shuts. I hear the creaking of lock and bolt. Hark! In the courtyard, and down the rocky way, the roll of heavy wheels, the crack of whips, and the chorus of the Scani as they pass into the distance. I am alone in the castle with those awful women. Mina is a woman, and there is naught in common. They are devils of the pit. I shall not remain alone with them. I shall try to scale the castle wall farther than I have yet attempted. I shall take some of the gold with me, lest I want it later. I may find a way from this dreadful place. And then away for home. Away to the quickest and nearest train. Away from this cursed spot, from this cursed land, where the devil and his children still walk with earthly feet. At least God's mercy is better than that of these monsters, and the precipice is steep and high. At its foot, a man may sleep as a man. Goodbye all, Mina. I couldn't really stop to comment on a lot of that because it's such a good chapter and it's so well written. Bravo, bravo, Bram Stoker. So Jonathan, the stakes are just mounting and mounting. Jonathan knows that they have taken the box in which Dracula is in away from the castle. He's been left here with those vampire women who want to tear him to shreds, drink his blood. And so he decides, I'm going to try to escape, and I'm going to have to escape out on the castle wall, and I'm going to have to go farther than I can go. And if you didn't catch, he says that, I might fall. I might fall to my death, but it's actually a good thing that I'm so high up, because it will be a quick death. And as he says, God's mercy is better than the mercy of whatever these monsters are in the castle. So a lot of good versus evil, a lot of holy versus unholy imagery. And I've been hard on Jonathan, but I feel for him. Our boy Jonathan has been through it. And now he's got nothing to lose. And he's just got to try to escape. He tried to kill the thing that is Dracula. Failed miserably. So I don't know about y'all, but this is a great chapter. The adventure, the horror, the emotion. I mean, I'm probably too dramatic with it, but I get carried away reading because it is truly, when you're imagining this and you along with Bram Stoker's words and my own imagination, you're on this adventure with Jonathan and the nature in which the novel is written, the fact that we're reading his journal entries, and we only get updates of his journal entries when we know that he has lived through whatever happened previous. It really puts you in it. In the next chapters, we're going to meet our main women of Dracula, Mina and Lucy, and I think that will be interesting. I haven't read this book for a while, and being around Mina and Lucy's age, I hope that I will have things to say and I will have new takes when I reread the chapter. And I hope that I can do justice to really getting into these two characters who, as the women of Dracula, have been portrayed in, myriad different ways over the years, and who represent myriad different things to men and women, who reflect a lot of the social mores of the time, who take on a lot of properties and ideas about women and ideas about monsters and human nature. I hope that I'll be able to do them justice and that we can have a conversation about Mina and Lucy, who are iconic characters in vampire literature. So I just want to say thank you if you're still with me and if you've watched my first 3 videos. I'm really dedicated to this. I'm having so much fun. And if you're here and if you're enjoying this, I really thank you. And I'm hoping I will get better. This is my 3rd video. I'm hoping I'll get better and more comfortable as we continue. So thank you guys. The dusk bell has tolled. It's been a good one. We're going to continue through this fantastic and iconic work of literature. I've said it a million times, I'm being repetitive, but thank you. If you're with me, and comment, let me know what you think. Give me a like, give me a subscribe if you feel so inclined, and I will see you when dusk next falls.